He entered the courtroom as if he owned it, as confident as a general entering a battlefield he had conquered 100 times before. His uniform was pressed, his insignia glinting in the light, a symbol of authority that he believed would continue to protect him, as it always had. But today, the atmosphere in the room was different. And when the judge refused to play by his rules, his world began to crumble quickly. The tension in the Birmingham District Courthouse was so intense it could have been cut with a knife. Even before anyone spoke, the look said it all. Another case of police brutality. Another officer accused of using excessive force against an unarmed black man. The story was so familiar, it was a painful cycle. This city had seen too many of it. Justice had become an elusive concept, a luxury the community no longer believed in. The courtroom was packed. Journalists sat in the front row, notebooks ready to take down every detail. Victims' families sat silently, pain in their eyes. Community members, some hopeful, others skeptical, waited to see if justice would actually be served this time. At the center of it all was Judge Imani Thompson. A force of nature, impartial, with no tolerance for nonsense. In 15 years on the bench, she had handled every type of case imaginable. Violent criminals, corrupt politicians, high-profile fraud cases, and too many cops accused of abuse of power. She believed in the law, but something about today made her feel different. From the moment she entered the courtroom, she felt the weight of all eyes. Some hopeful. Some skeptical. Some waiting for her to fail. She straightened her robe, took a deep breath, and sat down. In front of her was a thick file, State of Alabama vs. Officer Mark Reynolds. The name was familiar. Reynolds had been in and out of court many times, but never the defendant. The complaints against him had been mountain-sized: excessive force, racism, intimidation, but they had all been dismissed, buried, or explained away. This time was different. This time there was video. Indisputable, unspeakable video. His victim, a young man, was fighting for his life in the hospital. And Mark Reynolds, a 30-year veteran officer, honored on paper but feared on the streets, was finally facing justice. His reputation in the black community was no secret. If he stopped you, you knew it wouldn't end well. And he had always gotten away with it, never once having a disciplinary record. Today, his eyes scanned the courtroom, searching for familiar faces, allies who had always defended him. But this time, the seats he expected to be filled were empty. No one was here to shield him. Judge Thompson sighed. She had handled difficult cases before, but when it came to police accountability, the stakes were always higher. She had been called biased, simply because she demanded that police play by the same rules as everyone else. She had been threatened, targeted, labeled a problem. Danielle straightened her coat and stood, taking a deep breath to calm herself. "Sir." She turned to the defense table, where Mark Reynolds sat with Russell Keegan, a veteran of getting officers out of trouble. Keegan nodded, his voice soft but confident. "Sir, the defense is ready." He wasn't nervous. This wasn't his first dance. But there was something different about the courtroom today, something that perhaps even Keegan hadn't anticipated. Judge Imani Thompson, from the moment she took her seat, had silenced the courtroom. Without flowery words, without stiff gestures, her mere presence was enough to set the tone. Her sharp eyes scanned the room, a determination that would have put even the most seasoned attorneys on edge. Mark Reynolds sat there, arms crossed, jaw clenched, eyes cold, without a trace of remorse. The room was tense, but no one, not the lawyers, not the jury, not even Reynolds himself, could have known how far this trial would go. Because today was not like any other trial. Today, everything changed. Imani Thompson was not a judge who sat there reading from a script. She had fought her way to this position. Born and raised in Memphis, Tennessee, she knew how the world worked for people like her. She had seen firsthand how justice varied based on race, status, and connections. Having watched her father get harassed by police without cause, her brother pulled out of a car looking suspicious, she had vowed to change the system from within. She had worked day and night to pay her way through Howard University, her eyes stinging from long nights of studying. When she became a public defender, she didn't just take cases, she fought for every life, every fate she defended. Forgotten lives, marginalized families. She had seen too much injustice to allow in her courtroom. Today, the mood was heavier than usual. Victims' families sat silently, holding hands, lips moving in prayer. On the other side, Reynolds's colleagues from the police station sat silently, their faces unreadable. But Reynolds couldn't hide his emotions. He didn't say a word, but the way his fingers tapped the table, the slight curl of his lips in disdain, it all said too much. And Judge Imani Thompson saw it all. Not a single detail was missed. This was going to be a long day. But more importantly, this was a day no one in this courtroom would ever forget. Judge Imani Thompson stared at Officer Mark Reynolds. Her gaze was cold, unwavering, as he stared back at her with undisguised defiance. It wasn't the first time she'd faced men like this, men who believed the badge on their chest made them invulnerable. Men who thought power was a weapon, not a responsibility. But Imani was used to them, and she didn't flinch. "Officer Reynolds, please stand." Her voice was calm, but there was an undeniable weight to it. Reynolds stood, slowly, deliberately. His shoulders were square, his chin raised, as if to project authority over her. But Imani didn't flinch. She held his gaze, meeting his challenge with unwavering determination. "Do you understand the charges against you?" she asked. There was a moment of silence, and then Reynolds finally spoke. His voice dripped with arrogance, each word more of a challenge than a response. "Yes, Judge, I understand." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Families of the victims nervously clasped hands, reporters bent over notebooks, pens scratching at the pages. But Imani did not react. She had dealt with complacent defendants, those who thought the law could be bent to their will. She knew the kind, those who thought they could intimidate her out of justice. But she was not easily intimidated. "Let us proceed," she said, turning to the prosecutor. "Miss Pierce, you may begin." Danielle Pierce stepped forward, her sharp eyes flicking over Reynolds before turning back to the jury. Her voice was even but firm. "Your Honor, the prosecution will present evidence that Officer Reynolds used unjustified excessive force against an unarmed civilian, resulting in near-fatal injuries. We will prove that his actions were not only reckless, but a gross abuse of his power." Reynolds sneered. A small, sarcastic chuckle. Imani turned her head toward him, her eyes flashing sharply. "Is something funny, Officer Reynolds?" He shook his head, still smiling contemptuously. "No, ma'am. It's interesting to hear how they talk about me." The way he said it, the way he didn't take it seriously, made the atmosphere in the courtroom heavier. Imani tapped her gavel with her finger. This wasn't just a trial. This was a battle for justice. Once again, she had to prove that the law applied to everyone, badge or no badge. But there was one thing she didn't know: Mark Reynolds wasn't just an arrogant cop. He was much more dangerous. The courtroom had seen all sorts of defendants, but Reynolds was a different breed. He walked in late, not late enough to be disrespectful, but late enough to make sure everyone was seated before he showed up. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a message. The heavy door swung open, and Reynolds strode in like he owned the place. No hesitation. No hint of humility. Just unwavering confidence. His uniform was pressed perfectly, the badge gleaming on his chest. He didn't need to wear a uniform to court, but he did. Because he wanted the jury to see it first. Imani looked at him, her heart clenching. This wasn't just a trial. This was a test. And she wasn't going to let him win. Judge Imani Thompson watched him as he approached the defense table. Her sharp eyes had seen too many like him before, men who saw themselves not as defendants, but as untouchables. Men who believed the law was something they enforced, not something they obeyed. Reynolds did not rush to sit. He scanned the room, assessing each face on the jury, as if weighing his chances. He let his presence permeate the air, quiet but defiant. His attorney, Russell Keegan, nodded, a silent signal, and finally Reynolds sat. But even then, he did not straighten his back, but leaned back in his chair, a gesture that conveyed his disinterest, as if he were wasting precious time here. On the other side, the victim's family sat only a few feet away. A mother with dark eyes, her hands clenched white, her son still fighting for his life. A father, shoulders stiff, fingers gripping the edge of his chair, as if a blink might cause him to lose control. But Reynolds didn't look at them, not once. His eyes were on one person only, Judge Thompson. She didn't turn away. But there was something in his gaze that made her breath slow. It wasn't just arrogance, it wasn't just defiance. Something darker, something like certainty. The court clerk began to read the charges. Assault with excessive force. Misconduct in public office. Reynolds didn't blink. Didn't move. Didn't react. When the prosecutor made his opening statement, he just sneered. A small sound, but it was as sharp as a knife. And when Danielle Pierce, a young, but fiery attorney, looked straight at him and declared, "This trial will prove that no one, not even those with badges, is above the law." Reynolds actually laughed. A low, almost inaudible chuckle. But Judge Thompson heard it. Her fingers pressed into the smooth wood of the bench. "Officer Reynolds," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a sharp knife. "Is there anything you would like to share with the court?" Reynolds exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly, his lips curling into an unreadable smile. "No, sir," he said, his tone soft, but this time, dripping with a sarcastic sneer. For a second, Imani's lips pursed. But she quickly covered it up, continuing as if unaffected. She had dealt with people like him before, people who lived off of other people's reactions. They wanted to see fear, to see their threats work. But today, Reynolds had no control. And despite his confidence, there was something unsettling in his eyes. Not just arrogance, but a strange certainty. As if he knew something the rest of the room didn't. Imani tightened her grip on the arms of her chair, her eyes never leaving his. Today, she was ready for the challenge. Ready for the hostility, the tension, the weight of what was to come. But she couldn't deny that, this time, there was something else lurking in the air, something more dangerous. Something that hadn't yet been revealed. The case had barely begun, but the air in the courtroom was already boiling. Danielle Pierce stood tall, her hands clasped in front of her. Her expression was controlled, but her voice carried weight. "Your Honor, the prosecution will prove that Officer Mark Reynolds used excessive force, violating both departmental protocol and the victim's civil rights." She turned to the jury, making sure to look them in the eye. "We will present video evidence, witness testimony, and medical reports that leave no room for doubt." Reynolds barely looked at her. He sat, arms crossed, an unreadable expression on his face. He was a man who had sat through countless hearings like this and walked away unscathed. But this time, Danielle sensed something different, an undercurrent she had never been prepared for. She continued, "We will also present documentation that Officer Reynolds has been the subject of numerous complaints over the years, complaints that have never resulted in disciplinary action." At that, Reynolds chuckled. Not loudly, but enough to make the courtroom tense. Judge Imani Thompson immediately turned to him. "Officer Reynolds, you will not interrupt this proceeding any further." He didn't respond right away. A second passed, then another. The courtroom held its breath. Then he slowly nodded his assent. "Your Honor," he said, but there was no real respect in his voice, only patience, a kind of patience that was like a warning. Danielle glanced at Judge Thompson, waiting for permission to continue. With a slight nod from the bench, she stepped forward. "We would like to call our first witness to the stand. Victim Elijah Carter." A murmur rippled through the room as the double doors opened. Elijah was wheeled in by his mother, his face still bruised and stitched along his forehead. His left arm was in a cast, the wound still fresh and undeniable. But Reynolds didn't look at him. Not a glance. Not a hint of remorse. Elijah's mother helped him onto the witness stand, gripping his shoulders before stepping back. Danielle approached Elijah carefully. "Can you describe what happened the night of March 12th? Elijah hesitated. He couldn't have been much older than 21, and his voice was still heavy, like someone trying to convince himself that the world wasn't as cruel as it had made him out to be. "I was walking home," he said, his voice low. "I went through an alley near my apartment. I've done it 100 times before." He swallowed. "That's when I saw the headlights." Danielle nodded, encouraging him to continue. "I heard the sirens, and then the voice told me to stop. So I stopped." He looked down at his lap, gripping the arms of the chair. "I didn't run. I didn't argue. I did everything you're supposed to do." Danielle felt her heart beat faster. She had been prepared for this case, for the heated arguments, for Reynolds's contempt. But she hadn't been prepared for how far he'd gone, not just in his actions, but in his terrifying calm about the consequences. Suddenly, she realized, this wasn't just a trial. This was a warning. Elijah's mother wiped away tears, her fingers trembling as they traced his cheek. She had heard this story many times, but each time, the pain still washed over her like a wave. Danielle's voice was calm, as if she was used to such testimony. But something sharp flashed in her eyes. "And then what happened?" she asked. Elijah let out a shaky breath. He tried to swallow the lump in his throat. "He told me to put my hands up. I did. Then he told me to get on my knees." Elijah paused, his jaw clenched, his voice lost in his throat. "And then?" Danielle asked, her eyes never leaving Elijah. "And then?" His voice caught. "He lunged at me." The room was eerily quiet. Elijah's mother clasped her hands together, trying to keep her composure. Danielle's face remained impassive, her expression cold, but something in her eyes darkened. "When you say, charged, what do you mean?" Danielle asked, her voice sharper. Elijah clenched his fists in his thighs, his nails digging into his flesh. "I mean he slammed me to the ground and hit me over and over, even after I stopped moving. Even after I stopped fighting." His mother closed her eyes, her shoulders shaking. Her pain spilled out, silent but heavy. Danielle turned to the prosecutor's table. "Judge, I would like to introduce Exhibit A." Judge Thompson nodded. "Proceed." A screen lit up at the front of the courtroom. The video was shaky, but the facts were unmistakable. Elijah was on his knees, his hands raised. Reynolds moved toward him quickly, without hesitation, without warning. A brutal tackle, fists slamming into Elijah's ribs. His face slammed into the pavement. The muffled sounds of gasps, "Please." Then the silence was crushing. The room fell silent as the scene ended. Judge Thompson turned to Reynolds. "Officer Reynolds, do you have anything to say before we move on?" He sat up, cracking his knuckles. Then, for the first time, he smiled. No one in the room was ready for that reaction. There was no shock, no remorse. Just a smile. Judge Imani Thompson stared at Reynolds, studying the way he sat there so comfortably for a man watching his own violence. "Go ahead, Officer Reynolds," she said, her voice even. "Do you have anything to say?" Reynolds leaned forward, his elbows on the defense table, his fingers intertwined as if he were having a casual conversation. "I just find it amusing, Your Honor." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Danielle Pierce stood by the prosecutor's table, taking a slow breath. Do you deny that you used excessive force? Reynolds shrugged. What I'm saying is that it's a matter of context. His voice was controlled and smooth. That video doesn't show everything. It doesn't show me chasing this kid for blocks. It doesn't show him looking at me like he was about to run, like he had something to hide. Elijah stiffened in his chair. I wasn't running, he said, his voice sharp. I was walking home. Reynolds finally turned to face him. And for the first time, his smirk faded a little, there was something cold in his gaze. You were in a high-crime area, Reynolds said, tilting his head, his voice as dry as a foregone conclusion. It's late, and you fit the description. Judge Thompson leaned forward, placing both hands on the bench. Officer Reynolds, are you suggesting that the presence of this young man justifies your answer? Reynolds did not respond immediately. After a long pause, he let out a soft laugh. With all due respect, Judge, we all know how it works. The tone was neither arrogant nor amused, but cold, like a deadpan admission. The words hung heavy in the courtroom, stifling, like a smoke cloud filling the air. This was not just an excuse, this was acceptance. A public declaration that he knew exactly how the system worked and that he had nothing to gain by protecting him. Judge Thompson felt something tighten in her chest. She had spent her career fighting against this very way of thinking, against the codes of silence, the silent nods, the things that weren't on the books but were casually accepted. She tapped her fingers on the bench. Just this once, Officer Reynolds. Reynolds held his gaze, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. For the first time, something flashed across his face. Just for a second. Almost like discomfort. Keegan, his attorney, leaned in and whispered something in his ear. Reynolds exhaled through his nose, nodding slightly. Understood. Then leaned back. But he was still smiling. Judge Thompson turned to Danielle. Proceed with your next witness. Danielle hesitated, then nodded. The prosecution calls Sergeant Michael Owens to the stand. The door opened, and a uniformed officer entered. Owens, about 40, had gray hair at the temples. His posture was stiff, but cool as he approached the stand. He had served with Reynolds for years. When he was sworn in, Reynolds' expression finally changed. The smile disappeared. Owens cleared his throat, 12 years. And in those 12 years, had he ever witnessed Officer Reynolds use excessive force? The courtroom fell silent. All eyes were on Owens. He shifted slightly in his chair, his fingers tapping absently against his knees, his gaze drifting to a point in front of him. Then, slowly, he nodded. A ripple of commotion rippled through the room. Murmurs, sharp intakes of breath. Judge Imani Thompson glanced toward the gallery, and the voices immediately quieted. Danielle stepped forward, her voice calm but sharp. Can you clarify what you mean by yes? Owens sighed, his shoulders slumping as if weighed down by the memory. I mean, yes, I've seen this before. It's not the first time Reynolds has done this. Reynolds finally moved from the defense table. His shoulders were straight, his lips were pressed together, his hands were on the table, clenched into fists. His eyes never left Owens, but his expression was frighteningly blank. Danielle kept her tone even. And did you ever report it? Owens hesitated. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, no. Why? Owens's jaw clenched. The room froze, waiting for an answer. Finally, he said, hoarsely, because no one wanted to listen. The words hung in the air like a slap. Everyone seemed to hold their breath. Reynolds turned to face Owens. His face was blank, but his eyes were blazing with anger. Danielle let the moment sink in before asking. Sergeant, do you believe Officer Reynolds used excessive force against Elijah Carter? This time, Owens didn't hesitate. Yes. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, the snap of a reporter's pen. Judge Thompson banged his gavel. Order in the courtroom. It took a moment for the noise to subside, but the mood had changed. One of them had spoken. Danielle nodded, not asking any more questions. Judge Thompson turned to the defense table. Mr. Keegan, your witness. Keegan stood, buttoning his suit jacket carefully. He approached the stand slowly, a smirk on his face. Sergeant Owens, he said softly. How long have you been with the police department? 17 years. And in all those 17 years, you've never said a word about Officer Reynolds before. Owens hesitated. No. Keegan tilted his head. And today, you suddenly have a lot to say. Owens clenched his hands into fists in his lap. I should have said something sooner. Keegan shook his head, his smile turning cold. How convenient. Reynolds chuckled, shaking his head. Owens glanced at him but didn't respond. Keegan turned back to the judge. No more questions, Judge. Judge Thompson let out a slow sigh. She could see what Keegan was doing, discrediting the witness, sowing doubt in the minds of the jury. But then, something changed. Reynolds didn't move much, just shrugged. But Judge Thompson saw it, and so did Owens. The sergeant tensed, his fingers curling on his knees. Reynolds wasn't just looking at him, he was warning him. Judge Thompson glanced toward security, just in case. Danielle Pierre stood up again, her voice clear. The prosecution wants to close our case. Judge Thompson nodded. Very good. She turned to the defense table, her eyes darting daggers over Keegan. Does the defense wish to call any witnesses? Keegan shook his head, his face expressionless. No witnesses, Your Honor. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of a decision. Judge Thompson raised his eyebrows, his eyes narrowed in assessment. Proceed. Keegan stood, cleared his throat. Your Honor, in light of the evidence presented today, the defense moves to dismiss the charges against Officer Reynolds immediately. There was a crackle, not of gunfire, but of reaction in the courtroom. The victim's family gasped, a reporter hissed a curse under his breath. Some of the jury looked shocked. Judge Thompson's fingers tightened around her gavel, feeling the heat rising from her palm. She turned to Keegan, her voice as sharp as a knife. On that basis? Keegan smiled, a thin, knife-like smile, but there was a calculating glint in his eyes. Lack of credibility from the prosecution's key witness. He gestured to Owens, who sat rigid, his face pale. Sergeant Owens has admitted that he has been withholding vital information for years. His sudden confession was nothing more than an attempt to protect his own career. Judge Thompson's pulse pounded in his ears. This was what they did. They bent the system, twisted it, manipulated it until it was impossible to tell right from wrong. Her stomach clenched, because she could see the story taking shape in the news, the headlines, the backlash. This case was spiraling out of control. And Mark Reynolds knew it. He leaned back in his chair, his icy gaze locked on her. A slow smirk returned to his lips, as if victory had been decided. But what Reynolds didn't know was that Judge Imani Thompson wasn't done yet. The courtroom was still in chaos, the whispers whispering like a smoldering storm. A heavy skepticism hung in the air like a thick fog. She sensed the change, the way power moved in rooms like this, the way truth didn't always mean justice. Keegan straightened his tie, and kept his thin smile. The defense maintains its motion to dismiss immediately. The words cut through the air like a sharp knife. Keegan blinked, caught off guard. Even Reynolds's smirk faltered for a fleeting second. Judge Thompson placed both hands on the podium, leaning forward a little. This case will proceed to a conclusion. The jury will decide. Reynolds exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. That arrogant confidence never wavered. Keegan cleared his throat. I understand what you mean, but I'm not done yet. Judge Thompson's voice rang out, firm, like an inescapable command. She turned, looking directly at Reynolds. Officer Reynolds, stand. There was a momentary hesitation, just a moment, but enough for her to notice, and then he stood, shoulders square, eyes unapologetically apologetic. Judge Thompson kept her face neutral, but her words were etched into the dead silence of the courtroom. I need to make something clear. Her voice was steady, carried like an oath. Justice is not a favor. It is not a negotiation. It is not reserved for those who wear a badge and denied to those who do not. It applies to all. Reynolds barely blinked. But in the way he swallowed, in the hard line of his jaw, Judge Thompson could see it. A small crack in his pride. And she knew, this battle wasn't over. Judge Thompson let the silence linger, her eyes scanning the courtroom, where the tension was as tight as a string. This trial is not about protecting you, Officer Reynolds. This is about holding you accountable if you believe you're wrong. For the first time since the case began, Reynolds' smirk was gone. A small, almost imperceptible change, but real. For the first time in his life, he was looking at a system he couldn't bend. The jury was watching, the cameras were tracking his every expression, and the weight of what was happening was suddenly beyond his control. Then the courtroom door swung open. A court officer rushed in, breathing heavily. Sir, the FBI is here. The courtroom froze. Murmurs arose, quickly hushed by Judge Thompson's icy glare. She straightened as the officer approached, handing her a file. She opened it, flicked through the pages, and pressed her lips together. She looked up, her gaze determined. They have a federal indictment against Officer Reynolds. A gasp filled the room. Reynolds paled, his eyes wide, but he said nothing. Judge Thompson needed no more time to consider. Officer Reynolds, I order you taken into federal custody, effective immediately. Reynolds' mouth opened, as if to protest, but no words came out. His pride was cracking, piece by piece. Keegan stood up, urgently. Sir, this is beyond my control. Mr. Keegan. Her voice was cold. We all know that. The door opened again. 2 federal agents entered, their movements swift and professional. They advanced on Reynolds, unhooking his handcuffs. Instinct made him take a step back. His hands jerked, like a cornered animal. And that was when Judge Thompson saw it, the moment he understood. For years, he had walked into this courtroom with absolute confidence, knowing he would walk out the same way. But not today. Today, he was no longer in control. One of the agents said, "Turn around." Reynolds hesitated for a beat, 2 beats. His jaw clenched, his fingers flexed. A small, almost imperceptible shift in posture, a reflex of a man accustomed to getting his way through force. But before he could do anything, Judge Thompson spoke. Her voice was low, unhurried, but unmissable. Stop being a coward. At that, Reynolds froze. Not what she said, but the way she said it, calm, firm, like a sharp blade cutting through his thin armor. His fists clenched, his whole body tensed. But he didn't move. The agent stepped forward, flicking the handcuffs onto his wrists. Snap. A simple sound, but one that carried terrible weight. And for the first time in his career, Mark Reynolds was the one being led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. No one noticed the irony of the moment. Not the jury. Not the reporters scribbling in their notebooks. Not Elijah Carter's family, who were watching silently. But Judge Thompson noticed. And she was sure Mark Reynolds did, too. She watched as he was taken away. Her face was unreadable, but when the door closed, there was a sigh of relief, as if she could finally let go of an invisible weight that had been weighing on her shoulders. Not victory, not joy, just a tired relief after a long fight. She was exhausted, but she knew she had done the right thing. Finally, she took the gavel, gripping it tightly in her hand. With a sharp, powerful gesture, she declared the case was before the court. Justice doesn't always come easily. It doesn't always come in time. But some truths are too big to ignore. This isn't just a case. It isn't just an officer. It isn't just a single moment in time. It's about a system that has protected people like Mark Reynolds for too long. Power isn't permanent. And no one, no matter how many years they've hidden behind a badge, can escape accountability forever. If more cases like this were to come to light, what would you think? Should those who abuse power face the same consequences as everyone else? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe in justice, if you believe in the power of truth, make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Because these stories need to be told.